Thank you for staying with us. Now, several thought leaders on the African continent are getting together for a reflection on the 20 years since the African Union. The event, organized by the Institute for Pan-African Thought and Conversation, will bring together leading scholars and civil society to discuss problems encountered by the body since its formation. So let's now discuss this even further. We're joined by Dr. Adeoye Akinola, who's the head of research and teaching at the Institute for Pan-African Thought and Conversation at the University of Johannesburg. Doc, thank you for your time and good afternoon to you.
Thank you. Good afternoon.
I think before we get into some of the complexities and challenges faced by the African Union, just give us some context and perhaps even a history lesson. Why was the African Union even formed to begin with?
Thank you very much. If you recall, after the liberation struggles across Africa, political elites across the continent decided to put together an international organization, the Organization of African Union. But it was primarily to contend with colonialist power to be able to liberate many African states. So they later recalled that OAU was not actually facilitating development across the continent. Perhaps maybe they have seen the successes of the European Union and they thought a more regional organization would be able to harness African resources towards facilitating development across the continent. So they came together and decided to replace the African Union with, the African Union, the organization of OAU with African Union. So in 2002, AU was established.
Right. In your opinion, decades later since its formation, do you think the AU has achieved its objectives?
Depending on the lens within which we are trying to look at the performances of the AU. But one thing we keep trying to communicate despite their failings is that the continent has been better with the African Union. It could have been worse. So that's why there is still a little bit of something to celebrate despite their shortcomings. They've been able to achieve moderately, particularly in terms of peace and securities, and also in terms of other milestones, which might not be too big in terms of quantifying the achievements.
Yeah, I would say that some of the criticism that the continent has received, the AU as well as African leaders, includes poor governance. I'm sure you would agree with me there. Issues around, security issues, issues around corruption, greed, lack of more of a Pan-African, overview instead of almost imposing colonial and Western ideas into Africa. What do you think informs some of these challenges still faced by African leaders?
One thing we have to also understand is that, one, African Union has not become a supranational organization, so it's still an international organization. And states are not coerced, they are not mandated to respond to the dictates of the African Union on one side. We also need to understand that African Union is exceedingly elitist. It is being driven by political leaders. Many of the leaders have also failed in their respective countries. So we're not really expecting that miracle from the African Union. In terms of governance, and that's one thing we have said in criticism of the African Union, is that they are very reactionary. They are not proactive, so they don't tend to check misgovernance in states. But when we have, for instance, in the Sahel, now you have different kinds of military coup, democratic reversal, they tend to react to that. But it would have been better to have put in place a mechanism that would have prevented even military coup in the first place, and that has been some of the criticism and the failings of the African Union.
Yeah. And any progress that you think Africans should equally note made by the AU?
Yes, they have really recorded some successes. Of course, they are moderate, and we expected they could have done better. In terms of peace and security, despite the fact that we don't seem to see it, they have actually tried to intervene in many instances in Somalia, despite the fact that people expected more, in Congo DRC, even in terms of military code. They have also been able, internal diplomacy, of course, it might not be too open to the common man on the street, but in terms of mediation, presently they are intervening in the Ethiopia-Tigray conflict, and even their team up South Africa this week as we are speaking. So there are things they have done in terms of even the Russia-Ukraine war. They have also been able to play a part. Of course, some of us have also criticized their intervention. But I'm saying what they have tried to do is just to respond to African challenges, but they have their own internal challenges as well that tend to actually impede the level of performances they would have loved to record.
Right. Doc, I want to also talk about, the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, and your view on their response rate to the pandemic. Obviously, one unique not only to Africa, but the entire world. How would you rate the AU's response rate?
The ability of the AU to perform has to be placed within the context of the global economic system that we have. Africa has been at the receiving end. They have been subjective. They are dependent on other nations like the US, Britain. So it is exceedingly difficult for the AU to act unilaterally to begin to contend with those global powers, even when they began to express vaccine nationalism. If you are receiving funding from maybe the United States, it's too difficult for you to condemn them in strong terms. But they've also been able to actually develop the CDC, which we have in Addis, and to be able to also reinforce the voices of Africans to say human lives matter. And then in the United States, in Italy, in Israel, in Africa, we are all human beings and we should have the same relative access to COVID. So for me, I think they have tried, but more could have also been recorded on that note.
Right, and one would say, COVID-19 has almost allowed Africa to take a couple of steps backwards when it comes to Agenda 2063. We know that's a developmental framework policy with which the AU has been trying to progress to reach some of their goals for 2063. But how would you say they're faring, and what's the way forward in terms of still achieving some of the policies under Agenda 2063?
Thank you so much. And it is because of this we are also trying to bring together these policymakers, civil society organization, people across the divide, even African in the diaspora, to also come and discuss how the AU could actually lead Africa better in terms of achieving Agenda 2063. For instance, we talk about a prosperous Africa, Africa that is free, without conflict, without security, but we also know that there are still guns blasting across African states, and they tend to silence the guns, but they've been unable to silence the guns. Emerging conflicts are actually destabilizing parts of the continent. What I think the AU also needs to do effectively is not to be state-centric in terms of their intervention, maybe economic intervention, political, because I said we want to be more Western than the Western. Most of the time they deal with the state, but some of the time we have also realized that the state has become a problem. So you might need to pass above the state, behind the state, to be able to reach the civil society organization and even the people. The African Union, in a way, has failed to do that. But I also know that sometimes we don't really have enough information about what they do, and that's why they are trying to roll out now this information dissemination so that people will also have a grasp of what they have been doing. But generally, I think they should involve people outside government more, so that whatever they are doing will be more effective.
Yeah, and just my last question to you, funding as a challenge. How do you recommend that they go about this challenge in terms of funding its own projects?
It's exceedingly difficult. I know, because I know the AU has struggled to actually fund some of the templates they have designed for themselves. Most of the time they rely on external fundings, and when you rely on external funding, one, it curtails what you can do internally, and we are talking about African solution to African problem. I think it is time that, apart from the AU, heads of states in the continent must be responsive. There are private corporations that can actually contribute to the growth of the African Union. There are private individuals that can. I've seen some of African individuals giving money to the United Nations when we have the African Union suffering. So I think African Union also should begin to look inwardly and see how they can harness the little resources that people have, that companies have, that the civil society could also put on the table, for the development of the African Union. Without money, there's little the African Union can do.
Well, I appreciate you speaking to us about this, Doc, because it's not only a problem for the AU, but also you're saying let private sector be involved, let individuals also contribute to making this organization a success. Dr. Adeoye Akinola, Head of Research and Teaching at UJ Institute for Pan-African Thought and Conversation, thank you for your time.
Thank you.